Peter the Great. Peter I. Peter Alexeyevich ruled the Tsardom of Russia and later the Russian Empire from the 7th of May 1682 until his death, jointly ruling before 1696 with his elder half-brother, Ivan V. Through a number of successful wars he expanded the Tsardom into a much larger empire that became a major European power. He led a cultural revolution that replaced some of the traditionalist and medieval social and political systems with ones that were modern, scientific, westernized, and based on the Enlightenment. Peter's reforms made a lasting impact on Russia, and many institutions of Russian government trace their origins to his reign. Title: The imperial title of Peter the Great was the following: By the grace of God, the most excellent and great sovereign Prince Peter Alexeyevich, the ruler of all the Russias, of Moscow, of Kiev, of Vladimir, of Novgorod, Tsar of Kazan, Tsar of Astrakhan and Tsar of Siberia, sovereign of Pskov, great prince of Smolensk, Tversk, Ugorsk, Permsky, Vyatsky, Bulgarsky and others, sovereign and great prince of Novgorod, Nizovsky lands, Chernigovsky, of Ryazan, of Rostov, Yaroslavl, Belozovsky, Udorsky, Kondyevsky, and the sovereign of all the northern lands, and the sovereign of the Avarian lands, of the Kartlian and Georgian kings, of the Kabardan lands, of the Circassian and mountain princes, and many other states and lands western and eastern here and there, and the successor and sovereign and ruler. Life. Early years. From an early age, Peter's education was put in the hands of several tutors, most notably Nikita Zotov, Patrick Gordon, and Paul Menesius. On the 29th of January 1676, Tsar Alexis died, leaving the sovereignty to Peter's elder half-brother, the weak and sickly Fyodor III. Throughout this period, the government was largely run by Artemon Matveyev, an enlightened friend of Alexis, the political head of the Naryshkin family and one of Peter's greatest childhood benefactors. This position changed when Fyodor died in 1682. As Fyodor did not leave any children, a dispute arose between the Miloslavsky family and Naryshkin family over who should inherit the throne. Peter's other half-brother, Ivan V, was next in line for the throne, but he was chronically ill and of infirm mind. Consequently, the Boyar Duma chose the 10-year-old Peter to become Tsar with his mother as regent. This arrangement was brought before the people of Moscow, as ancient tradition demanded, and was ratified. Sophia Alexeyevna, one of Alexei's daughters from his first marriage, led a rebellion of the Streltsy in April to May 1682. In the subsequent conflict, some of Peter's relatives and friends were murdered, including Matveyev, and Peter witnessed some of these acts of political violence. The Streltsy made it possible for Sophia, the Miloslavskys and their allies, to insist that Peter and Ivan be proclaimed joint Tsars, with Ivan being acclaimed as the senior. Sophia acted as regent during the minority of the sovereigns and exercised all power. For 7 years, she ruled as an autocrat. A large hole was cut in the back of the dual-seated throne used by Ivan and Peter. Sophia would sit behind the throne and listen as Peter conversed with nobles, while feeding him information and giving him responses to questions and problems. This throne can be seen in the Kremlin armory in Moscow. Peter was not particularly concerned that others ruled in his name. He engaged in such pastimes as shipbuilding and sailing, as well as mock battles with his toy army. Peter's mother sought to force him to adopt a more conventional approach, and arranged his marriage to Eudoxia Lopukina in 1689. The marriage was a failure, and 10 years later Peter forced his wife to become a nun and thus freed himself from the union. By the summer of 1689, Peter planned to take power from his half-sister Sophia, whose position had been weakened by 2 unsuccessful Crimean campaigns. When she learned of his designs, Sophia conspired with the leaders of the Streltsy, who continually aroused disorder and dissent. Peter, warned by the Streltsy, escaped in the middle of the night to the impenetrable monastery of Troitsa-Sergeyevo-Lavra. There he slowly gathered adherents who perceived he would win the power struggle. Sophia was eventually overthrown, with Peter I and Ivan V continuing to act as co-czars. Peter forced Sophia to enter a convent, where she gave up her name and her position as a member of the royal family. Still, Peter could not acquire actual control over Russian affairs. Power was instead exercised by his mother, Natalia Nereshkina. It was only when Natalia died in 1694 that Peter became an independent sovereign. Formally, Ivan V remained a co-ruler with Peter, although he was ineffective. Peter became the sole ruler when Ivan died in 1696. Peter grew to be extremely tall as an adult, especially for the time period. Standing at 6 feet 8 in height, the Russian Tsar was literally head and shoulders above his contemporaries both in Russia and throughout Europe. Peter, however, lacked the overall proportional heft and bulk generally found in a man that size. Both Peter's hands and feet were small, and his shoulders were narrow for his height. Likewise, his head was small for his tall body. Added to this were Peter's noticeable facial tics, and he may have suffered from petit mal, a form of epilepsy. Early reign. Peter implemented sweeping reforms aimed at modernizing Russia, heavily influenced by his advisors from Western Europe. Peter reorganized the Russian army along modern lines and dreamed of making Russia a maritime power. He faced much opposition to these policies at home, but brutally suppressed any and all rebellions against his authority. Streltsy, Bashkirs, Astrakhan, and the greatest civil uprising of his reign, the Bulivin Rebellion. Peter implemented social modernization in an absolute manner by introducing French and Western dress to his court and requiring courtiers, state officials, and the military to shave their beards and adopt modern clothing styles. One means of achieving this end was the introduction of taxes for long beards and robes in September 1698. To improve his nation's position on the seas, Peter sought to gain more maritime outlets. His only outlet at the time was the White Sea at Archangel. The Baltic Sea was at the time controlled by Sweden in the north, while the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea were controlled by the Ottoman Empire and Safavid Empire respectively in the south. Peter attempted to acquire control of the Black Sea, so he would have to expel the Tartars from the surrounding areas. As part of an agreement with Poland which ceded Kiev to Russia, Peter was forced to wage war against the Crimean Khan and against the Khan's overlord, the Ottoman Sultan. Peter's primary objective became the capture of the Ottoman fortress of Azov near the Don River. In the summer of 1695, Peter organized the Azov campaigns to take the fortress, but his attempts ended in failure. Peter returned to Moscow in November 1695 and began building a large navy. He launched about 30 ships against the Ottomans in 1696, capturing Azov in July of that year. On the 12th of September 1698, Peter officially founded the first Russian Navy base, Taganrog. Grand Embassy. Peter knew that Russia could not face the Ottoman Empire alone. In 1697 he traveled incognito to Europe on an 18-month journey with a large Russian delegation, the so-called Grand Embassy. Since he was far taller than almost anyone else, his fake name allowed him to escape social and diplomatic events, but did not fool anyone of importance. One goal was to seek the aid of the European monarchs. Peter's hopes were dashed. France was a traditional ally of the Ottoman Sultan, and Austria was eager to maintain peace in the East while conducting its own wars in the West. Peter, furthermore, had chosen the most inopportune moment. The Europeans at the time were more concerned about who would succeed the childless Spanish King Charles II than about fighting the Ottoman Sultan. The Grand Embassy, although failing to complete the mission of creating an anti-Ottoman alliance, continued. While visiting the Netherlands, Peter learned much about life in Western Europe. He studied shipbuilding in Zaandam and Amsterdam, where he visited, among others, the upper-class de Wilde family. Jacob de Wilde, a collector general with the Admiralty of Amsterdam, had a well-known collection of art and coins, and de Wilde's daughter Maria de Wilde made an engraving of the meeting between Peter and her father, providing visual evidence of the beginning of the West European classical tradition in Russia. According to Roger Tavernier, Peter the Great later acquired de Wilde's collection, thanks to the mediation of Nicolaas Whitson, mayor of Amsterdam and expert on Russia. The Tsar was given the opportunity to gain practical experience in the largest shipyard in the world, belonging to the Dutch East India Company, for a period of 4 months. The Tsar helped with the construction of an East Indiaman especially laid down for him, Peter and Paul. During his stay the Tsar engaged many skilled workers such as builders of locks, fortresses, shipwrights, and seamen, including Cornelis Croyss, a vice-admiral who became, under Franz Lefort, the Tsar's advisor in maritime affairs. Peter later put his knowledge of shipbuilding to use in helping build Russia's navy. Peter paid a visit to Frederick Ruysch, who taught him how to draw teeth and catch butterflies. Ludolf Bakhuyzen, a painter of seascapes, and Jan van der Heyden, the inventor of the fire hose, received Peter, who was keen to learn and pass on his knowledge to his countrymen. On the 16th of January 1698, Peter organized a farewell party and invited Johann Heidekoper van Marseveen, who had to sit between Lefort and the Tsar and drink. In England, Peter met with King William III, visited Greenwich and Oxford, was painted by Sir Godfrey Kneller, and saw a Royal Navy Fleet Review at Deptford. He travelled to the city of Manchester to learn the techniques of city building he would later use to great effect at St. Petersburg. The embassy next went to Leipzig, Dresden, and Vienna. He spoke with August the Strong and Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. Peter's visit was cut short in 1698, when he was forced to rush home by a rebellion of the Streltsy. The rebellion was, however, easily crushed before Peter returned home from England. Of the Tsar's troops, only one was killed. Peter nevertheless acted ruthlessly towards the mutineers. Over 1,200 of the rebels were tortured and executed, and Peter ordered that their bodies be publicly exhibited as a warning to future conspirators. The Streltsy were disbanded, and the individual they sought to put on the throne, Peter's half-sister Sophia, was forced to become a nun. In 1698, Peter sent a delegation to Malta under Boyar Boris Sheremetev to observe the training and abilities of the Knights of Malta and the fleet. Sheremetev investigated the possibility of future joint ventures with the Knights, including action against the Turks and the possibility of a future Russian naval base. Peter's visits to the West impressed upon him the notion that European customs were in several respects superior to Russian traditions. He commanded all of his courtiers and officials to wear European clothing and cut off the long beards, causing his boyars, who were very fond of the beards, great upset. Boyars who sought to retain the beards were required to pay an annual beard tax of 100 rubles. Peter also sought to end arranged marriages, which were the norm among the Russian nobility, because he thought such a practice was barbaric and led to domestic violence, since the partners usually resented each other. In 1699, Peter changed the date of the celebration of the new year from the 1st of September to the 1st of January. Traditionally, the years were reckoned from the purported creation of the world, but after Peter's reforms, they were to be counted from the birth of Christ. Thus, in the year 7207 of the Old Russian calendar, Peter proclaimed that the Julian calendar was in effect and the year was 1700. Great Northern War. Peter made a temporary peace with the Ottoman Empire that allowed him to keep the captured fort of Azov, and turned his attention to Russian maritime supremacy. He sought to acquire control of the Baltic Sea, which had been taken by the Swedish Empire a half-century earlier. Peter declared war on Sweden, which was at the time led by King Charles XII. Sweden was also opposed by Denmark, Norway, Saxony, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Russia was ill-prepared to fight the Swedes, and the first attempt at seizing the Baltic coast ended in disaster at the Battle of Narva in 1700. In the conflict, the forces of Charles XII used a blinding snowstorm to their advantage. After the battle, Charles XII decided to concentrate his forces against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which gave Peter time to reorganize the Russian army. As the Poles and Lithuanians fought against the Swedes, Peter founded the city of St. Petersburg in Ingermanland in 1703. He forbade the building of stone edifices outside St. Petersburg, which he intended to become Russia's capital, so that all stonemasons could participate in the construction of the new city. Following several defeats, the Polish king August II abdicated in 1706. Swedish King Charles XII turned his attention to Russia, invading it in 1708. After crossing into Russia, Charles defeated Peter at Golovkin in July. In the Battle of Lesnia, Charles suffered his first loss after Peter crushed a group of Swedish reinforcements marching from Riga. Deprived of this aid, Charles was forced to abandon his proposed march on Moscow. Charles XII refused to retreat to Poland or back to Sweden, instead invading Ukraine. Peter withdrew his army southward, destroying along the way any property that could assist the Swedes. Deprived of local supplies, the Swedish army was forced to halt its advance in the winter of 1708 to 1709. In the summer of 1709, they resumed their efforts to capture Ukraine, culminating in the Battle of Poltava on the 27th of June. The battle was a decisive defeat for the Swedish forces, ending Charles's campaign in Ukraine and forcing him into exile in the Ottoman Empire. In Poland, August II was restored as king, Peter, overestimating the support he would receive from his Balkan allies, attacked the Ottoman Empire, initiating the Russo-Turkish War of 1710. Peter's campaign in the Ottoman Empire was disastrous, and in the ensuing peace treaty, Peter was forced to return the Black Sea ports he had seized in 1697. In return, the Sultan expelled Charles XII. Normally, the Boyar Duma would have exercised power during his absence. Peter, however, mistrusted the boyars. He instead abolished the Duma and created a Senate of 10 members. The Senate was founded as the highest state institution to supervise all judicial, financial and administrative affairs. Originally established only for the time of the monarch's absence, the Senate became a permanent body after his return. A special high official, the Oberprocurator, served as the link between the ruler and the Senate and acted, in Peter's own words, as the sovereign's eye. Without his signature, no Senate decision could go into effect. The Senate became one of the most important institutions of Imperial Russia. Peter's northern armies took the Swedish province of Livonia, driving the Swedes into Finland. In 1714 the Russian fleet won the Battle of Gangad. Most of Finland was occupied by the Russians. In 1716 and 1717, the Tsar revisited the Netherlands, and went to see Hermann Boerhaave. He continued his travel to the Austrian Netherlands and France. The Tsar's navy was so powerful that the Russians could penetrate Sweden. Peter also obtained the assistance of the Electorate of Hanover and the Kingdom of Prussia. Still, Charles XII refused to yield, and not until his death in battle in 1718 did peace become feasible. After the battle near ULAN, Sweden made peace with all powers but Russia by 1720. In 1721 the Treaty of Nystadt ended what became known as the Great Northern War. Russia acquired Ingria, Estonia, Livonia, and a substantial portion of Karelia. In turn, Russia paid 2 million riksdaler and surrendered most of Finland. The Tsar retained some Finnish lands close to St. Petersburg, which he had made his capital in 1712. Later years, Peter's last years, were marked by further reform in Russia. On the 22nd of October 1721, soon after peace was made with Sweden, he was officially proclaimed Emperor of all Russia. Some proposed that he take the title Emperor of the East, but he refused. Gavrila Golovkin, the state chancellor, was the first to add the great father of his country, Emperor of all the Russias, to Peter's traditional titles following a speech by the Archbishop of Pskov in 1721. Peter's imperial title was recognized by Augustus II of Poland, Frederick William I of Prussia, and Frederick I of Sweden, but not by the other European monarchs. In the minds of many, the word emperor connoted superiority or preeminence over kings. Several rulers feared that Peter would claim authority over them, just as the Holy Roman Emperor had claimed suzerainty over all Christian nations. In 1718 Peter investigated why the ex-Swedish province of Livonia was so orderly. He discovered that the Swedes spent as much administering Livonia as he spent on the entire Russian bureaucracy. He was forced to dismantle the province's government. After 1718, Peter established colleges in place of the old central agencies of government. The new agencies were originally 9 in number: Foreign Affairs, War, Navy, Expense, Income, Justice, Inspection. Later others were added. Each college consisted of a president, a vice president, and a number of councillors, assessors, in addition to one procurator. Some foreigners were included in various colleges but not as president. Decisions depended on the majority vote. Peter believed he did not have enough loyal and talented persons to put them in full charge of the different departments. Peter preferred to rely on groups of individuals who would keep check on one another. In 1722 Peter created a new order of precedence known as the Table of Ranks. Formerly, precedence had been determined by birth. To deprive the boyars of the high positions, Peter directed that precedence should be determined by merit and service to the emperor. The table of ranks continued to remain in effect until the Russian monarchy was overthrown in 1917. Peter decided that all of the children of the nobility should have some early education, especially in the areas of sciences. Therefore, on the 28th of February 1714, he issued a decree calling for compulsory education, which dictated that all Russian 10 to 15-year-old children of the nobility, government clerks, and lesser-ranked officials must learn basic mathematics and geometry, and should be tested on it at the end of the studies. Peter introduced new taxes to fund improvements in St. Petersburg. He abolished the land tax and household tax, and replaced them with a poll tax. The taxes on land and on households were payable only by individuals who owned property or maintained families. The new head taxes, however, were payable by serfs and paupers. By the same time, the once powerful Persian Safavid Empire to its neighboring south was heavily declining, making advantage of the profitable situation. Peter launched the Russo-Persian War of 1722 to 1723, otherwise known as the Persian Expedition of Peter the Great by the Russian historiographers, in order to drastically increase Russian influence for the first genuine time in the Caucasus and Caspian Sea, as well as to prevent the Ottoman Empire from making territorial gains in the region at the expense of declining Safavid Iran. After considerable successes and the capture of many provinces and cities in the Caucasus and northern mainland Persia, the Safavids were forced to hand over the territories to Russia, comprising Derbent, Shirvan, Gilan, Mazandaran, Baku, and Astrabad. However, 9 and 12 years later all territories would be ceded back to Persia, now led by the charismatic and military genius Nader Shah, as part of the treaties of Resht and Ganja respectively, and the Russo-Persian alliance against the Ottoman Empire, which was the common enemy of both. In 1725 the construction of Peterhof, a palace near St. Petersburg, was completed. Peterhof was a grand residence, becoming known as the Russian Versailles. Religion: Peter was not religious and had a low regard for the church, so he put it under tight governmental control. The traditional leader of the church was the Patriarch of Moscow. In 1700, when the office fell vacant, Peter refused to name a replacement, allowing the Patriarch's coadjutor to discharge the duties of the office. Peter could not tolerate the thought that a patriarch could have power superior to the Tsar, as indeed had happened in the case of Philaret and Nikon. He therefore abolished the Patriarchy, replacing it with a Holy Synod that was under the control of a senior bureaucrat. The Tsar appointed all bishops. In 1721 Peter followed the advice of Ferovan Prokopovich in designing the Holy Synod. It was a council of 10 clergymen. For leadership in the church, Peter turned increasingly to Ukrainians, who were more open to reform, but were not well loved by the Russian clergy. Peter implemented a law that stipulated that no Russian man could join a monastery before the age of 50. He felt that too many able Russian men were being wasted on clerical work when they could be joining his new and improved army. A clerical career was not a route chosen by upper-class society. Most parish priests were sons of priests, were very poorly educated, and very poorly paid. The monks in the monasteries had a slightly higher status. They were not allowed to marry. Politically, the church was impotent.